No shining wisdom lit a road through the thicket for Truman and his advisers. Some of their ignorance was excusable, because no one knew or could know much about the never-used atomic creation. Many facts that became known after it was unleashed weren't known before. The military chiefs, for example, were convinced an invasion would be necessary even after the bombs were dropped, and they continued planning for it while the arrangements for the bombings went ahead. Nor could they know much about the effects of radiation, since the scientists were uncertain about it. A few predicted disaster, and a sprinkling warned that a catastrophic chain reaction might endanger the entire world, but the great majority disagreed. Nevertheless, the American leaders were characteristically uninterested in the non-military aspects of the new munitions, to which they devoted scant consideration or discussion. Nor was any serious proposal not to use the bomb made or entertained. Time has shed new light on those lapses. During the half-century following the advent of the new bomb, it took on much symbolic weight that wasn't felt at the time, when it was perceived essentially as merely a much more powerful weapon. Knowing what was then known under the then enormous pressures to end the awful war, as opposed to enjoying the luxury of retrospective judgment, only some higher order of human being would have made different decisions or agonized about them much more than Truman did. And even now, very few commanders-in-chief are much concerned about limiting casualties apart from their own. Still, the president and his advisers knew far too little about Japanese history and culture, just as they did about, one might add, non-white male Americans, such as women, blacks, and Native Americans. They cared far too little for the Japanese people. It was almost cynical to have expected Hiroshima residents to take action on the leaflets, warning them of impending destruction. Consciously or otherwise, they, like the country as a whole, were steeped in racism. Their concern barely extended beyond winning the war and saving American lives. However, that too misses the point, since the question, once again, is not about them or why they chose to do what they did, but the consequences. Their failures, the selfishness, narrow nationalism, unwillingness to grapple with the full significance of their decisions, didn't change the situation in Japan. Even if the feeble peace faction did manage to turn tables on the militarists, the improbable relief would have come only months or years into the invasion of the mainland, when millions of lives would have been lost. Yes, more willingness to negotiate and a better grasp of the enemy's sensibilities might have coaxed an earlier surrender, but that can be said of any war. And no enemy coaxing had less chance of success than with the commanding members of the Supreme War Council. If Ushijima's laughter at Buckner's surrender proposal was apocryphal, his rejection was no less absolute for that. Not everyone who knew how the Japanese fought approved the use of the bomb. Admirals Ernest King and William Leahy argued that a more hermetic maritime blockade than the one in place during the summer of 1945, coupled with more intense bombing and naval gunfire, would have forced surrender within a reasonable time. Leahy called the atomic bomb an inhuman weapon to use on a people that was already defeated and ready to surrender. We Americans had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. A scattering of high-ranking officers, none from infantry units, agreed. A few maintained there was no need for atomic bombs or an invasion. Deprived of supplies and food, Japan would have surrendered sooner or later. Most of that sprinkling spoke out only after the war, when evidence became available of just how severely American submarines had crippled Japanese industry. They apparently didn't notice that their argument also applied to the Palau Islands, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and the other murderous stepping stones. If blockades could have done the job, weren't the deaths there and at Okinawa also logically unnecessary? Either way, their voices were rare exceptions among the fighting men. Otherwise, an almost visible line separated those who judged Japanese intentions through the prism of combat experience from people further removed, military as well as civilian. Complaints about the atomic bomb's inhumanity in particular increased in proportion to their maker's distance from the hell to which the weapon had put an end. In general, Paul Fussell summarized. The principle is, the farther from the scene of horror, the easier the talk. To report that the less one knew about the island battles, the more likely one's disapproval is not to say combat participation was essential for reaching solid conclusions about the bomb, only that the very persuasive arguments against usually leave unmentioned the mortal costs of the alternatives, ignorance of which was likely to strengthen moral opposition. In any case, most of those with actual experience of Japanese behaviour during the war, as opposed to those who reckoned what it ought to have been, were certain blockade and bombing couldn't work. Actually, they might have. The Stars and Stripes and British Ensign flew from nearly 1,000 destroyers and destroyer escorts in August, and American yards were launching more every week. Stationed within sight of each other, they and the capital warships, supplemented by thousands of planes, could have sealed off the home islands. But it's hard to understand how that would have saved more lives or otherwise been more humane. On the contrary, it's almost certain the majority of Japanese would have voluntarily or compulsorily, in either case, agonizingly, persisted in rejecting surrender even after mass starvation. As Richard Frank concluded in his admirably restrained Downfall, the end of the Imperial Japanese Empire, a 1999 study based on archival research that makes many of the old arguments sound like uninformed ranting. Alternatives to the atomic bombs carried no guarantee that they would end the war or reduce the amount of human death and suffering. In particular, a blockade, which also wouldn't have distinguished between military personnel and civilians, would probably have been more barbarous because it would have taken more lives, probably many more, by pervasive famine spread by the destruction of the transportation system. It's even harder to imagine that conventional air attacks would have been halted during the process. Wars don't work that way, which may be partly why not even the blockade's handful of advocates suggested the bombing be suspended. Civilian casualties in the 80-odd Japanese cities firebombed by early August were already 3 to 4 times larger than those at Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. On August 1st, to take just one example, the secondary target of Toyama, a city of 130,000, was 99% burned to ashes, as one report specified. Saturation raids were reaching down to cities of 55,000 inhabitants because too little was left of Tokyo, Nagoya, Kobe, Osaka, Yokohama, Kawasaki, and other industrial centres to make additional mass attacks on them worthwhile. A key aide to General MacArthur would call those conventional raids one of the most ruthless and barbaric killings of non-combatants in all history. Radio Tokyo's term was slaughter bombing. Critics of using the atomic bombs would stand on firmer moral ground if they also protested the incineration of those cities. Their horror at the barbarity of Little Boy and Fat Man would hit harder if it included the killing of so many more hundreds of thousands of civilians by conventional weapons, and acknowledgement that it was certain to continue under the command of the passionately committed Curtis LeMay, the Air Force general who'd promised to beat Japan back to the Dark Ages. On the eve of the March firebombing of Tokyo that killed nearly 200,000, the general wired a colleague to be ready for an outstanding show. If every human life is equally sacred, how can the war's prolongation by more than a month be thought to have been better than a resort to nuclear destruction? And even if LeMay could have been restrained, starvation, exhaustion, and disease would have taken many times the toll of the 2 atomic bombs. That pertains to Japanese lives only. During the months or years of blockade and bombing, hundreds of thousands or millions of non-Japanese would have died, chiefly on the Asian continent, including those Allied prisoners of war whose numbers alone would surely have exceeded those of the atomic victims. Of course, Japan did capitulate, prima facie evidence that all the predictions about her refusal to do so was so much talk. On the other hand, how it was achieved strongly suggests that only the atomic bombs could have done it without the years of decisive battle or mass starvation. For surrender was barely accepted only when the Emperor spoke up, and that moment came only 5 days after Nagasaki. It was the terrifying atomic devastation that prompted his startling intervention, then tipped the balance among military commanders in favor of obeying him. Concluding an imposing study of the Pacific War, the historian Ronald Spector pronounced himself unable to demonstrate how the Japanese High Command might have been induced to surrender without the combined shock of the bombs and the Soviet entry into the war on August 8th. But while the Red Army's massive power was indeed an added factor, all available records of the thinking of the military leaders and of the Emperor suggest it was no more than that. The latter's imperial rescript, the unprecedented broadcast that summoned the nation to surrender, made no mention of expected Soviet offensives in Manchuria, perhaps because the army had already written them off, but spoke only of the crucial determinant. The new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable. Incalculable went well beyond the Emperor's toll of many innocent lives. The apparition of this almost supernatural weapon, said Churchill, gave the courageous Japanese people an excuse to save their honour and release them from their obligation of being killed to the last fighting man. He omitted non-fighting men, women, and children. Perhaps some other shock might have accomplished the same, but in the end it was the bombs that provided the face-saving opportunity. The spectacle of the immense American fleet at Okinawa, among the most graphic displays of conventional weaponry in history, had done nothing to reduce General Ushijima's 32nd Army's obligations to code and country. The troops loathed the American planes that pulverized them with virtual impunity from return fire, but fought on defiantly without thought of surrender. They took unimaginable punishment from every available weapon without cracking, until the pitiful 5% of survivors had been deprived of supplies, fortifications, and leadership. Brother soldiers would surely be even braver and tougher on the Sacred Home Islands with their immeasurably better preparation. No accumulation of bombs, shells, and bullets was likely to free them from their commitment. The chief of the Imperial General Headquarters Operations Section recorded that the geographical advantages of the homeland were to be utilized to the highest degree in that first and only battle in which the main strength of the air, land, and sea forces were to be joined. Even if that too was empty bragging, the mainland fighting would surely have been more ferocious than Okinawa's, more like the even harder struggle, far harder, if the 32nd Army hadn't lost its best unit, the crack 9th Division. Or it would have been worse yet, for the Japanese had guessed the American landing sites with terrible precision, and the invasion force wouldn't have had a 2-to-1 advantage in numbers, as at Okinawa. On the mainland, the opposing sides would have been roughly equal in size. An analyst of Olympic miscalculations would conclude that it would have been a nightmare for both sides, because far more Americans would have landed on Kyushu than the Japanese expected, and many more Japanese would have been waiting on the beaches, primed to counterattack with everything they had, than the Americans anticipated. It turned out that American intelligence, even with its code-breaking advantages, grossly underestimated the Japanese strength throughout the mainland. There was nothing new in that. The army was still expanding. Deployments discovered later were dismaying. As on Okinawa, the defenders managed to muster more and better equipped forces into critical strongholds than the Americans believed. Again, however, the crucial factor was resolution, not numbers. The Japanese leaders, especially War Minister Anami, had no incentive to surrender because they were fighting their different war, for face and honour, not victory. They were also confident of inflicting enough damage to break the enemy's morale, evidence of which they saw in every American attempt to propose surrender terms. So the military casualties alone, even if exaggerated by some post-war estimates, would have been immense. If the Battle of Okinawa dwarfed the Battle of Britain, the ultimate Tenozan would have been the most ambitious project in peace or war ever undertaken by the United States, involving thousands of ships, tens of thousands of planes, and more than 5 million men. History's greatest combat sausage machine might have ground up more American bodies than the entire war until then, in both the Atlantic and Pacific theatres. Everything rested with the 6 members of the Supreme War Council, most of whom essentially didn't care about the odds against them. They were psychologically blocked, capable only of stumbling forward, the distinguished historian John Dower concluded. Something was needed to free them from their trance. Hardship alone, no matter how severe, wasn't enough. The something had to be qualitatively different from the current mix of conventional arms and strategic pressurers, and perhaps it wasn't accidental that the people whose emperor was descended from the Sun goddess, and whose word for their nation, Nippon, is written with characters that mean origin of the sun, saw the atomic blasts as brighter than 1,000 suns. They signalled more than a new weapon. Their explosions represented more than the equivalent of 10,000 tons of TNT. They announced the appearance of another order of force, greater and more authoritative, and a way out for the land of the rising sun. Perhaps paradoxically, the way out may be seen as supporting an old Japanese belief that mercilessness is the swiftest route to a merciful peace. Japanese hatred of her white enemies was certain to have swelled as their conventional bombs and shells destroyed the country. Were the atomic bombs humane in the long run, by quickly ending the war and curbing that? Didn't the Vietnam War's years of peace negotiations take many more lives? All that is, of course, speculative, and nuclear weapons may yet become the scourge of humanity by fatally contaminating the planet, if not demolishing large parts of it. But until then, if and when that happens, Okinawa's caves, killing grounds, and anguish should be remembered, together with the total of deaths there, which was greater than in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. The ambivalent human record suggests that the first atomic bombs probably prevented the homicidal equivalent of scores more of the same, the 5 to 10 million Japanese deaths if invasion had been necessary, in addition to all the others, Western and Asian. It's difficult to comprehend such figures and to remember the strains of 1945. Focusing repulsion on the bomb is easier. But if a symbol is needed to help preserve the memory of the Pacific War, Okinawa is the more enduring one. 30. Aftermath. General Stilwell, the new American commander, announced the campaign's official end on July 2nd, 9 days after Okinawa had been declared secure. When a final surrender ceremony was held 2 months later, almost all the fighters were gone. The Marine divisions had been relieved by Army troops within days of the June 23rd flag raising and shipped out, some savouring a fairly silly rumour that they were going home. In fact, most went to Guam for rehabilitation and retraining, as mentioned, then to occupation duty on the Japanese mainland and the Asian continent. Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast, 9 days after the ruin of Hiroshima, flooded Guam with delectable new chatter. Home by Thanksgiving, by Christmas, by Easter, but not Dick Whittaker. In October, his regiment was shipped to China to help repatriati Japanese forces there. After the sweet revenge of watching officers humbly stack their swords, his battalion proceeded to other pleasures. Quartered in the port city of Tsingtao, it had the regiment's highest rate of venereal disease. Demobilized after 8 months in China, Whittaker returned to Saugerties on Memorial Day 1946, in time to watch Main Street's parade. He was still in uniform. There was little defiant trumpeting that the country was number one, but much affection for our boys. Friends hugged him. His hand was pumped for hours. It was, he'd remember, a good day to come home. The spectators dispersed after the parade. His parents walked home, Dick to George Broom's saloon. George looked the same, and the barstool felt the same. The first beer was on the house, the next was his. The war was over, the circle had closed. It had closed almost completely to those ignorant of battle, for the happy 20-year-old who'd never written home about its real hardships found himself still unable to talk about them now. Combat veterans didn't know how to do that. They didn't want to brag to listeners who lacked the means to comprehend. "What's the point?" Gregarious Whittaker would ask in explanation of his near silence about his life's emotional apex and nadir. "How can anyone know?" Paul Fussell suggests another reason for the fighters' unspoken conspiracy of silence. They'd participated in an event that smeared a monstrous blot on the human race. The appalling outrages to decency so soon after those of World War I left them with a sense of shame for the species supposedly created in God's image. They were happy to forget them. Only other combat infantrymen knew, and none needed reminding, which is partly why veterans preferred swapping funny stories about the screw-ups to revisiting the horror. The funny thing is, they'd say one way and another, I remember more of the amusing incidents than the blood and the gore. Meeting others who did know would give them an infusion of battlefield camaraderie's unique intensity as long as they lived, but their glow needed no extra stimulus then, in 1946. Although Whitaker was saddened to see many more gold stars on the yellowing honour rollover broom's fireplace, some signifying the deaths of friends, his own name there generated deep satisfaction. After months of beers and laughter, the saloon doors stopped swinging with the newly demobilised. All who had made it through the war were home. Now the party too was over, but Whitaker remained proud. So did almost every American who returned from the edge without crippling injury. He had a lifelong reservoir of pride and self-confidence, even if outsiders would never know what filled it. Mark Jaffe, a first lieutenant who'd broken down with shock during his first fighting on an earlier island but returned to win a Bronze Star for gallantry below the Shuri line, knew his life had been irrevocably changed. Whenever I ran into physical or psychological hardships later, I thought of Okinawa. I knew if I could survive that, I could survive anything. Jaffe and the others talked as little about the highs as the lows, but they'd never forget. Would they do it again, even with the excruciating fear and misery? You bet they would, especially when asked while basking in their neighbours' grateful admiration and savouring the knowledge that they'd never have to do it again. That was the peak. My proudest moments. I can't explain it, but they were the best days of my life, when I was best. The battle is over, but Japan is still fighting. If we can decrease the enemy's power by even 1 or 2 men, that is our duty. A Japanese straggler on Okinawa. While the band that greeted Whitaker's troopship in San Diego banged cymbals in the hearts of her 1,000-passenger veterans, no music played on the wrecked Japanese piers at which a trickle of Japanese ex-soldiers arrived from Okinawa in wretched defeat. Family members, themselves physically and spiritually traumatized by the ruinous war, welcomed their own with joyful pity, but many held the once-vaunted army as a whole in scorn. The memory would remain hateful to most Japanese. In 1963, 18 years after the surrender, less than 1% of all surveyed by a television station remembered the war as the best period of their lives. The exceptions were presumably super-patriots and ex-officers, now in the cold of Japan's powerful post-war anti-militarism. Moreover, most Okinawa veterans felt scarcely human at the time of their homecoming, which was still far off for a good number. The war that was over for Whitaker and his fellows dragged on for the 32nd Army's stragglers. For those thousands, during the first months after the collapse of organised resistance, the American flag-raising and surrender ceremonies might as well have been on the moon. Even if the desperate fugitives had heard of the 10th Army's designation of the island as secure, it would have meant nothing to them. "We shot 3 more nips last night," a Marine laconically recorded in his diary a week later. When the 32nd Army dissolved, few of its members were alive without some freakish act of providence, perhaps supplemented by their temperament. The surviving 10% probably had a higher-than-average quotient of initiative and individuality, qualities that would now count even more, as with the inhabitants of the last cave of medic Ikuo Ogiso, the actor turned de facto surgeon. More skeletons than soldiers, the macabre creatures had sunken eyes, uniforms stiff with mud and excrement, and no direction other than their own. When the cave was surrounded, the unit's chief medical officer ordered his 25 nurses' aides to exit and surrender. Calling themselves Yamato Nadeshiko, proud and virtuous Japanese women, those erstwhile students from a less prestigious high school than Ruriko Morishita's, pleaded for permission to remain and die with the soldiers, or to join them on a breakout to the north. But the officer remained adamant, and the girls obeyed. Ogiso would later write with relief that his commander, although a major in rank and a China veteran, saw his true mission as a medical doctor concerned with preserving life rather than a professional soldier who takes it. Thanks to him, 20 of the girls were eventually saved, 20 precious lives, mothers who now enjoy a peaceful life. The 80-odd men who remained after the aides had left survived remorseless satchel charges and phosphorus bombs, but fear of death drove some to get it over with by running from the mouth. The others burrowed deeper into the vast cave, which was near the southern village of Itosu. In accordance with Divisional Headquarters' last order to continue fighting, passed down from General Ushijima's final message, Ogiso's chief instructed his men to form groups for sorties from the cave. The major then dissolved cyanide in the last of his alcohol and swallowed it, or was injected by an aide, as some near him believed. The cave was too dark for Ogiso to see. Leaving for their final attacks several nights after the 10th Army's declaration of the end of organised resistance, the first groups felt as if a bad dream were animating their limbs. While the human bullets inched toward American positions until they were hit by conventional ones, 6 of the most respected and resourceful doctors and senior staff members remained in the cave. They had decided to wait until the enemy's guard went down and invited the conscientious Ogiso to join them. The modern cavemen devised ways of preserving fire in the eternal wet, the most precious commodity in the world for us. One of the best methods employed cartridge powder, empty cans, and abandoned medical bandages woven into a slow-burning rope. Every flame was tended reverently, in fear of insanity without it. A supply of rotting rice gave the group several days of unhurried nostalgia and lice-picking between continued American explosions. Ogiso's cave was one of the prodigious southern ones that wove and twisted for mile after unexplored mile. Forced by American probes to move deeper into it, the gasping, tottering Seven explored huge reaches of treacherous swampland, jagged mountain ranges, and secret passes unknown even by local Okinawans, a supernatural universe of eeriness and dread. Ogiso supposed the primal fear he felt in the perpetual darkness resembled that of human beings thousands of years earlier. The darkness and thick, sticky air coil around your skin, while a weird aura rises from the grotesquely shaped stalactites and water's slimy surface. To live shut up in that darkness all alone was beyond a normal human being's endurance. The subterranean existence was fashioning a new order of human experience, combining elements of Robinson Crusoe, The War of the Worlds, and Dante's Inferno. Other Japanese encountered in the menacing vastness, for the bands remained almost totally apart, as if belonging to separate tribes, looked like a prehistoric subspecies. Accumulated spectacles of suffering in the gargantuan dungeon finally corroded Ogiso's training and self-discipline. A demented soldier's shriek of "Banzai to the Emperor" as he flung himself to a watery death filled the patriot with deep anger at the once revered deity. "Emperor, do you really know? In your name, in places like this, men are dying unnatural, violent, miserable deaths." Yet the survivors sought to reassure themselves that they'd serve as guides for the forces who would soon arrive to liberate Okinawa. With ships like Yamato leading her superb navy, how could Japan lose? Months in the utterly sunless damp also bred physical affliction. To end the unbearable pain of a stomach disease, Ogiso armed a grenade and pulled the hissing metal to his chest. A doctor in the group kicked it away just in time. When the survivors finally emerged 2 months later, they joined a small army of stragglers who returned to underground refuges throughout the day, but spent nights careering through the countryside. Most began by trying to obey the order to penetrate to the mountainous north. One of the most persistent rumours was of units supposedly intact in a heavily forested area near the island's northern tip. Its name, Kunigami, was whispered as if it meant deliverance or secret superweapon. Shelling had so altered the landscape that finding their way would have been difficult in the darkness, even with a map. The North Star was the primary beacon to the mythical forest holdout with its vividly pictured food, weapons, and clean water. When band after band was slaughtered attempting to reach it by snaking through the American lines, some thought of swimming there with baskets of debris on their heads, intended to blend with the battle's heavy flotsam in the water, or floating to the mainland on rafts. American sentries on beaches leisurely picked them off, but the majority of stragglers simply existed, their goal reduced to staying alive until their rescue by the imagined Japanese counterlanding. The more principled groups agreed among themselves that individuals discovered by an enemy patrol or injured too seriously to carry on would unburden the others by killing themselves. But those who kept that promise delivered a fearful blow to their friends, of whom ever fewer were left. The still living roamed fields, smelling of the earth, whose fragrance they might be savouring for the last time, and of the decaying corpses they'd perhaps join before dawn, for they lived in constant dread of being shot at any second. "Thank God American sentries speak loudly even on duty," one man noted. Fleeing their bullets, slithering back and forth, lossing their way in villages whose every landmark had been destroyed, the human wrecks wormed from their caves and burrows every night to haunt southern Okinawa, inadvertently crunching rotting skeletons in the dark and passing cave entrances, eerily glowing from the phosphorescent explosives tossed inside. They met, scattered, exchanged rumours, scavenged, and watched their numbers inexorably decline. The nightly activity lasted 3 or 4 hours, from when the Americans fell asleep in their tents to the first suggestion of dawn. Failure to return to a burrow or find a new one, even if it reeked with decomposing bodies, was a virtual death sentence. "I wanted to grab the sun and smash it down," a straggler forced to endure the terror of several days above ground would remember. American leaflets proclaiming further resistance useless because Japan had capitulated were half believed. Some wept reading reprints of the imperial edict of surrender. Others predicted that anyone who followed the American instructions for surrender, discard all arms, appear on specified beaches holding up a leaflet, would be tortured to death. Although the majority had lost all desire to keep fighting and used their remaining weapons only to save their lives, they lacked the will to free themselves from their new form of enslavement. Others, or the same men at different times, became determined to kill at least one of their monster hunters before the end. Chased into fields by American pacification units, some groups threw their last grenades at them and were filled with frustration when they didn't explode, or with satisfaction when they heard enemy screams. Others tossed grenades into audiences at outdoor movies or ambushed squads searching for them. The most daring crept into tents and massacred the sleepers, or more often stole food and weapons with growing expertise, sometimes even taking time to search for cigarettes. One team made off with a portable USO phonograph and records of the current American hit songs. Others interrupted their forays to enjoy moments of the open-air movies without trying to disrupt them. The victors lit grass fires to chase the desperados into walls of automatic fire. A straggler who returned alive from a pass covered by a machine gun reported seeing a red river of Japanese blood. When American dogs missed a man, despite coming close enough for him to hear their panting, the trembling prey wondered whether it was because his months of bestial life had changed his smell from human to something else. Other terror-stricken groups sniffed the cigarette smoke of search patrols almost on top of them. The Army's rigid class system and class consciousness collapsed. Similar aim and outlook were now what drew together the clusters that formed, and they were led by men of ability rather than rank. One straggler observed that unthinkingly obedient Japanese soldiers had become naked human beings who came together and dispersed by the force of human attraction and repulsion. Officers insulted to their faces by privates nevertheless begged them for admission into their groups. Exclusion or expulsion was a terrible fate, usually leading to starvation as well as the anguish of isolation, that state so achingly contrary to Japanese instinct. Some men joined groups headed for almost certain death at passes covered by machine guns, not out of non-existent hope, but for the last comfort of numbers. Friends promised each other to stay alive, but weaker ones gave up the exhausting work of hiding and allowed themselves to be killed. Other friends swore to each other never to separate under any circumstances, but of course did when bursts of enemy fire scattered them in terrified chaos, or they simply lost touch in the dark. It was great credit to them that a semblance of civilized behavior survived. The most seriously wounded men sometimes begged to be killed for the sake of the others. Some of those unable to join the forays for food would accept none, believing they had no right to it. But although acts of generosity and self-sacrifice were not uncommon among the newly made comrades, most bands regarded all others as rivals, sometimes quarrelling savagely over hiding places and tactics, while some members hated the gigantic Japanese military power that thrust us into this utter misery. With all the intensity remaining in their frail bodies, others threatened to kill anyone who mentioned surrender. Few of either stripe could keep themselves above the struggles over food. By September, an outsider who stole a morsel from a group's supply risked instant death. One ring cautiously dug up a portable safe their unit commander had buried before killing himself. They were ecstatic to find bundles of thousands of 100-yen bills stacked inside, because the paper on which the fortune was printed was enough to cook a canteen of rice. Some groups fought others like bandit gangs for a cache of anything edible, sometimes with swords and to the death. Food included wormy sweet potatoes and worms themselves. Arriving at new caves, starving survivors rummaged feverishly among decomposing corpses. The rucksacks still on the backs of the bodies were putrid with rotting flesh, but the men managed to swallow hardtack that had dried rock-like after its soaking in blood. Perhaps the unluckiest Japanese of all were those who suspected the truth about the end of the war, but feared retaliation by others, mostly non-commissioned officers, who were convinced their duty was to stay ready to join the Japanese counterlanding. Whatever the 32nd Army had suffered before, the surviving stragglers endured more, and by this time for longer than the campaign itself. By early 1946, the several hundred Okinawan soldiers who remained loyal to the Imperial Army lived in the same predicament as the fair percentage of Japanese survivors who wanted to surrender but didn't know how. Although some used the same caves for rest stops, the two nationalities usually remained separate and less engaged in barter. Shinichi Kuniyoshi, the native boy who repeatedly defied death to deliver the message to Yozadake, shared the life of desperate fleeing and hiding. Now 15 years old, he was approaching collapse from exhaustion and the pain of maggots eating his flesh at every cut and scratch. As much as he was able to think at all, Shinichi realized he wanted to continue living, but he had no idea how to give himself up. Masahide Ota was slightly more committed. After his failure to escape by swimming and inexplicable washing ashore, he made his way inland to pursue the instinct for survival, but with no real hope of ending alive. A good half of the normal school's 400 students would survive, but only about a quarter of his class of 128. The starving 20-year-old ran into a fiercely patriotic Japanese second lieutenant, formerly assigned to guard duty at the 32nd Army's Shuri Castle headquarters, and now furious at the traitorous Okinawans whose betrayal had cost Japan the battle. Declaring that locals had no right to be in that sensitive area, he prepared to protect Japanese interests and vent his revenge by shooting the trespasser. Ota saved himself by thinking quickly enough to produce an old document certifying his assignment to intelligence operations. The tattered scrap in his pocket was miraculously still readable after his time in the sea and crawling in the fields. He sustained himself largely from American garbage dumps and the occasional tent into which he tossed a grenade to flush out its occupants before racing in to grab what he could. For companionship, he found an idealistic Japanese private named Shirai, a student of English literature, who, in defiance of everything, had carried a Webster's dictionary with him throughout the battle. When one night's booty from an American tent included a copy of Life magazine, Ota was surprised at how easily his upright older friend was able to read an article accompanying photographs of bomb-ravaged Japan, and amazed when he reported the war was over. Shirai, begging him not to repeat the news to other stragglers, some of whom would kill anyone who said such a thing, implored the youth to surrender. "You're a student, not a soldier. If you can survive and get out of this mess, you must study English. Come to Tokyo. I'll help you if I'm alive." Those fervent words would remain with Ota the rest of his life. They prompted a realization that he'd been a fool who didn't even know the supreme fact that the war was over, and wouldn't have believed it from anyone else's lips. Realizing he'd have remained a prisoner of his false beliefs without Shirai's knowledge of English, he suddenly knew he must stop fighting and start studying. In the end, some surrounded Japanese stragglers agreed to be disarmed, but not to be called prisoners. A sprinkling avoided the disgrace of capture by mingling with Okinawans and learning their ways well enough to avoid detection by the natives employed by Americans to weed them out. After a year, search teams found fewer and fewer stragglers. One discovered in 1972, nearly 27 years after the formal surrender, was almost certainly the last. Almost everyone taken alive in 1945 and early 1946 very quickly considered himself lucky. Jittery, angry Americans continued shooting a few with their hands up, but most of the defeated men ended safely in prison camps, where they weren't tortured but treated to what they took for unimaginable kindness and generosity, and looked back at their straggling days as their grimmest payment for believing Yamato propaganda. The greatest volume of surprise had come in late June 1945, when the greatest number of Japanese surrendered. Loaded onto boats in the south, many regretted not having killed themselves before being taken out for drowning, as they were convinced would happen. But when they reached large camps in the north, hundreds of stripped Japanese blinked in wonder at offers of water and cigarettes from the demons and beasts. One soldier asked for what he believed would be a final cigarette and got 6, which he smoked in a row after his long tobacco deprivation. Kuniichi Izuchi, the proudly patriotic artist, had killed many Americans and was certain he'd be hated as he hated them. But he was amazed by the captives' treatment as human beings rather than enemies. He even sensed a bond with his captors, inconceivable until then. They seemed to understand that he'd fought for love of his country just as they, a sudden revelation, loved theirs. The 22nd Regiment's chief medical officer, the lieutenant who'd grown close to Captain Kojo during the unit's annihilation, was among those astonished by Americans' humanistic behavior. One group of 100 or so prisoners waiting to be crushed by nearby tanks included Kenjiro Matsuki, the former first baseman. They could barely understand when the wounded among them were asked to come forward for trucking to a hospital. Others scarcely believed the rations they were fed, far better than their own during the fighting. Many were reduced to tears at the sight of enemy medics trying to save their dying comrades, American doctors treating maggot-infested Japanese wounds. A surgeon in a hospital tent cut open a cast on the arm of a warrant officer in Tadashi Kojo's battalion and ordered a medic to make a new cast with the wrist up instead of down, because, the doctor explained to the medic, the Japanese held their rice bowls palm up. The warrant officer was unforgettably moved by the surgeon's seemingly immense concern for human life. Izuchi was equally moved by distribution of quinine as generously as if to American themselves, to malaria-stricken Japanese from Ishigaki Island, where the American pilots had been beheaded. During the first days in POW camps, where minimal rations were received as startlingly generous and normal behavior toward captives seen as magnificent, the invariable Japanese astonishment led to the first serious questioning of their indoctrination, then anger at the authorities responsible for it. Man after man found life as a prisoner of the hated enemy better than as a soldier of the empire, with kinder treatment from their new superiors. But those who hadn't had that revelation because they were still outside the camps clung to their old attitudes and habits, enforced by the diehards among them. Although talk of the benefits of surrender spread among the stragglers, most remained captives of Japanese militarism. Tadashi Kojo had disbanded the last of his battalion on June 21st. In the dead of night, he crept down to the west coast beach with his sword, his adjutant, and their single grenade. Small craft patrolled with loudspeaker messages and machine gun volleys. The two hid behind bushes and boulders, living on hardtack and watching ragged groups flee every which way. Abandoning caution as useless, a few even lit fires to cook sweet potatoes. Kojo's plan was still to smuggle himself to the battalion of a sister regiment in the 24th Division that had reportedly been bypassed by American forces above the Shuri Line. Now the remnants, joined by other Japanese from service and airfield maintenance units, and still commanded by Captain Tsuneo Shimura, his academy classmate, were supposedly holding out not far from Kojo's former position at Kochi. Not all appeared lost to Kojo in the strange quiet following the disbanding of his own command. When the Americans stopped firing their big guns, they seemed to pull most of their ground troops inland. Unbelievably, for Japanese forces in that situation would have combed the beaches to completely finish off the enemy. Still, the captain's probing established that enough sentries and patrols were operating to make it almost impossible to sneak through to the north. He reckoned it might be safer for his adjutant and him to round the southern tip and work their way up the east coast. Pressed against the base of the cliffs or burrowed under boulders, hundreds of maimed Japanese hid along miles of shoreline or scurried on the beaches. The captain offered them occasional encouragement, but years later would be most proud of his advice to a young teacher with 5 schoolgirls. He spied huddled behind some rocks just as a patrol began cleaning the area with bullets and flamethrowers. When the frightened teacher asked for a grenade, Kojo asked why he wanted it, although he of course knew the reason. "We must kill ourselves, please." The captain postponed his flight from the patrol in order to formulate a persuasive refusal. He and his adjutant needed their 1 grenade for themselves, he said, and teachers had no need of them anyway because unarmed civilians unquestionably wouldn't be harmed. Although he actually believed Americans probably did rape and torture, he nevertheless wanted the little group to try to survive. "So you must go up to them and surrender yourselves," he pronounced solemnly. "You aren't military people, and you have no obligation to die for your honor. Do as the loudspeakers say." The enemy edged closer. When their hand grenades joined their bullets and flames, Kojo scurried in one direction, the teacher and pupils in another, not to be seen again. In a moment, something else gripped the captain's attention. The sole of an American boot appearing between 2 rocks directly above him. But its wearer's bullets missed from near point-blank range. His adjutant was First Lieutenant Yatsugi, a trusty Mustang who'd been commissioned during combat in China, then joined him as a replacement during the Kochi fighting. Climbing down a cliff several nights later, the two foraged for sweet potatoes until Kojo hit a tripwire and flares revealed Japanese corpses caught there hours earlier and still bleeding from bullet holes. Enemy soldiers surrounded them as they tried to crawl away. A last-second dash took them back to the cliff, but they lost the trail and couldn't climb up. Enemy rifles approached, glinting in the starlight. This time there would surely be no way out. Between his wild pantings, Yatsugi asked for the grenade. "What for?" Kojo asked again. "This is the end, Captain Kojo. I have to kill myself." "And what about me after you use it? Stop blabbering and follow me." His angry tone belied a calmness grounded in trust that instinct would dictate whether to use the grenade on Yatsugi and himself or on the enemy. The adjutant did follow him to an even more miraculous escape from the cliff, but extreme danger reappeared nights later in one of the breaks between the cliffs where machine guns completely covering stretches of beach chattered throughout the night at the human crabs stealing east and west. This one was in sight of Mabuni Beach below Ushijima's suicide ledge, where Kojo wanted to make his penetration inland and north. He and Yatsugi swam seaward to circumscribe its fire, but Kojo had been a weak swimmer even before the grave, still unhealed wound behind his ear, then his further enfeeblement at Kochi and afterward. "We won't make it. Let's go back," he shouted to the lieutenant. "No, Captain, I'm going to keep trying." Kojo never saw Yatsugi again. He would guess that his companion may have intentionally drowned. Alone now, the once haughty elitist joined the anonymous nocturnal creatures forming and leaving bands on their intuition about whom to trust. Thirst tortured them even more than in June. Although his seemed as vast as the ocean that blazed all day in the midsummer sun, he learned to avoid the springs that bubbled up from the foot of the cliffs at low tide. Most were littered with corpses over which the weaker-willed Japanese kept crawling in demented craving. American snipers up on the cliffs seemed to prefer the more challenging targets who made desperate dashes. Waiting beneath the same Mabuni cliff several nights later, Kojo strained for sounds of American patrols above. Hearing none, he finally climbed the nearly vertical rise. That feat, nearly inconceivable even if he hadn't been so weak, inaugurated a 2-month crawl in search of the enclave of his fellow battalion commander, 20 miles north as the crow flies. He ate almost anything. He slept in caves, in tombs, and in the open, occasionally on steep slopes. His feet braced against tree stumps to keep from falling. The sharper the incline, the less chance an American patrol would find him and shoot. One night, yearning for a cooked meal prompted him and some temporary companions. They'd been forcing themselves to swallow raw rice and sweet potatoes, to attack a jeep for matches. Bullets sought them out night after night, like rabbits during a hunting season. Enemy rifles fired from so close he could feel their muzzle blasts. Unlike the time with Lieutenant Yatsugi, he trembled violently while waiting for certain death. He tried to decide whether to use a pistol he'd found, knowing the return salvos after a single shot at an American would finish him in a second. The fearful tension of those episodes suppressed even his boundless hunger and thirst. Hours afterward, he remained too drained to open his mouth for a word to a fellow straggler. Nor did his escapes help him penetrate north of the Shuri line, along which he kept crawling until his sweat turned unrecognizably greasy, probably after so much stress with so little nourishment and sleep. The lights of a plane above a field where he wandered alone prompted fantasies of becoming a bird that could fly to his wife and parents to tell them he was alive. He had no explanation for the wild shooting from thousands of enemy guns one mid-August night, tremendous volleys that lit the sky with tracers, no doubt after. Emperor Hirohito's surrender message, which was broadcast on August 16th. But the subsequent cessation of kamikaze attacks, until then the targets of a huge volume of anti-aircraft fire from American ships, was ominous. Japanese encountered in the dark challenged Yama, mountain, and were answered with Kawa, river. Other passwords were Chu, loyalty to the emperor, and Ko, devotion to the family. Some reported that the bypassed battalion he was trying to reach was still operational. Inspiring news because its commander, Tsuneo Shimura, was an old drinking friend from Manchuria as well as an academy classmate. Kojo waited out the severe late August typhoon that delayed the formal surrender ceremonies by battering American ships en route to Tokyo Bay. Although he still had visions, no matter how absurd, of the arrival of the combined fleet, he believed he had no further duty or right to command anyone but himself. All he wanted was to keep going so he could die a warrior, an honour that beckoned much more brightly than life. The noble ideals absorbed during his Satsuma childhood bolstered his will when exhaustion had seemingly destroyed his body. It took enormous patience and cunning just to learn that his classmate's cave was on some high ground about 5 miles north of Shuri. Visions of it as the answer to everything sustained him despite all else. The September night when he finally reached the cave and contrived to safely enter it in the dark seemed a sanctified end to his stinking, terrifying odyssey. Overjoyed to see each other alive, the 24-year-old captains held hands and luxuriated in their wonderment and even sense of fulfillment, until Shimura announced he was going to surrender the very next morning. The war, he explained, was over. Japan had been defeated. Dangerously weakened, Kojo went into shock. Staring at his treasured comrade, he thought of his months of hunger, misery, and near-delirious efforts to stay alive in order to reach him, while Shimura quietly elaborated that he felt the Emperor's will must be obeyed. "You're right," the reeling listener finally managed to reply. "You have 300 men to feed and you should surrender, but I'm responsible only for myself. I'm going on alone." The part of him that couldn't accept Japan's defeat was stronger than the part that believed in it. To be gone from the cave when the unit surrendered, the exhausted shell of a man set out again before dawn with a naval warrant officer, a private met along the way, some pistols, and fervent good luck wishes from Shimura. He didn't question why he wasn't obeying the imperial order. He simply knew that his war had to end with his death. Inability to surrender had become an entirely personal matter, unrelated to national concerns. What point could there be in denying the entire meaning of his life by staying alive? The new group wandered to the former headquarters of Kojo's 22nd Regiment below Naha Airfield. From there, they dug through the rubble, blocking the entrance to the elaborate adjoining tunnel of the Naval Base Force. Although the corpses covering the floor were beyond the bloated stage, they emitted a corrosive gas at each touch, and the group couldn't move in the dark without trampling them. The smell and flies were worse than everything previously endured. Lighting a precious match, Kojo saw the bodies of radio men and operations personnel slumped over their transmitters in spaces he'd visited before leaving for combat in April. New slogans summoned from the blood-splattered walls: "Japan will never be destroyed. Japan will rise up like a phoenix." Their senses disabled and degradation almost complete, he and the others rummaged for food. More months passed in the dark of a succession of caves. When Okinawan civilians freed from their internment ventured into one of them later in the autumn, Kojo almost shot them for trying to persuade the stragglers to surrender, then realized other civilians would report them sooner or later. Sure enough, a jeep appeared before he'd had time to find another hiding place. The pacification unit consisted of an American driver, 2 Nisei interpreters, and a Japanese officer using an assumed Okinawan name. Their talk about the end of the war and the folly of further resistance was friendly in tone. Kojo stood apart when a second visit convinced most of the cave's inhabitants they wouldn't be killed if they submitted. However, he said to himself, while everyone had an absolute right to surrender, he had his own code. Nevertheless, something intrigued him about an enemy who lacked the slightest hint of a victor's hauteur or display of superiority, even in weaponry. Yes, the truck that accompanied the jeep might well be hiding a machine gun, but the curiously relaxed Americans didn't carry even pistols. Kojo had never seen a blue-eyed devil outside of combat and the parties that had been hunting him. Could his image of arrogant murderers be wrong? A voice told him to put an end to further thought by killing himself right now. The time had come again. Another voice observed that he alone was still trying to be a warrior. The enemy seemed to have moved on to new goals, apparently related to an entirely different kind of life. He'd been prepared for Americans flourishing guns and for insults to his honor. He'd have shot anyone like that who entered the cave, then shot himself. But would such a display make sense now? The first party had asked the stragglers to please prepare to give up their weapons. Some now did, others had buried theirs. Telling himself it was the responsibility of the senior Japanese present to observe carefully, Kojo inched closer. Then, in a kind of trance, he handed his pistol to an American lieutenant, which the latter returned, asking how to unload it. Was he an enemy or a wiser man? Kojo's realization of how easily he could have shot the lieutenant forced him to accept that the war had ended. He returned the pistol to the American, who invited him into the jeep. After 5 months of nocturnal existence, the sunlight blinded. When the men had been loaded into the truck, they were driven to a military police post and given cigarettes, then to a POW camp in the north. The last substantial group of Japanese POWs was repatriated in the spring of 1947, 2 years after L-Day. Kojo had had the luck to be released a year earlier, in late March 1946. He returned to bombed-out Tokyo and by train to leveled Kagoshima, where he spent almost a year in immobilized depression in a corner of his parents' house. Throughout the country, returning soldiers, those losers in their often terrible physical condition, were despised. Many became outcasts. In addition to the battle and the war, Kojo in particular had lost his beloved wife Emiko, whose parents were influenced by the severe social changes that turned Imperial Army officers from figures of admiration to objects of contempt. He himself shared the new anti-militarism. His first job, obtained with a fake resume to conceal his military profession, was as a laborer at an American air base. When he became a driver for an American high in the Occupation Administration, he resisted the influential lawyer's attempts to persuade him to join Japan's new self-defense force. Although he badly needed a better-paying job to support a new family, memories of Okinawa kept him a driver, even as his mental and physical strength slowly returned. "Japan doesn't need an army," he replied. "Japan must never fight again." Eventually, however, he did join the self-defense force, and in time advanced to captain again, before retiring in 1970. 50 years after his fighting, the scrupulously neat ex-soldier walked with some of his old ramrod straightness. One of the smaller post-war ironies is that the average Japanese survivor of the battle, that relative handful, is in better physical condition than the average American. Many also appear more prosperous, but not Kojo, who ignored friends' urging to apply for a pension for his war wound, the permanently damaged hearing. "No, I can't sell my ear to my country," he answered. "I must feel I did my duty." Post-war Japanese politicians who awarded themselves honors and rewards gave nothing to the veterans who returned half alive from Okinawa. Kojo is among the probable majority of ex-POWs who never lived down the stigma of captivity, although his came only after the destruction of his battalion, Japan's surrender, and his grueling months as a straggler. The old samurai in the Satsuma Sun lived on in devotion to the memory of General Ushijima, Colonel Yoshida, commander of his 22nd Regiment, and all who fought to the last and died in the fields or in the water in order to defend Okinawa. His loyalty was coupled with resentment of those who refer to the Imperial Army in flippant tones, and indignation that the superb conduct and sacrifice of our great army and the special attack forces at Okinawa are less celebrated than the tragedy of Okinawan civilians, represented by the Princess Lily Brigade or well-publicized atrocities committed on Okinawans by a few desperate soldiers. Anti-militarists, who insinuate that Okinawans are the only victims, disturb him particularly. "That's enough," I'd like to plead. "It's time to stop." Yet the war changed Tadashi Kojo radically, starting with liberation from the narrow focus of the Imperial Army officer. The once feared battalion commander now takes great interest in the outside world. He has also returned to his boyhood literary interests, using the English he taught himself after the war to work as a translator after retiring from the self-defense force. From his present peaceful life, the articulate, attractive 80-year-old looks back in horror and wonder at his former one as a rigid officer whose entire being was devoted to battle for honor and the emperor. When Okinawans look back, it's with little hope others will ever appreciate the battle's impact. Clarence Clacken's The Great Luchu ventures the illusion that the resilient people showed remarkable ability to stand up under physical and mental strain, the survivors having suffered little physical deterioration except for filth, disease and lice infestations. In fact, their cataclysm, if it didn't surpass Hiroshima's and Nagasaki's, lasted far longer. After most of the battle's explosives had fallen on them rather than the two armies, decimated families clung to life as if by their fingernails. Perhaps the point is made by the fact that the civilians who visited Tadashi Kojo's cave in November 1945 came in search of food from the wretched Japanese stragglers inside, who were themselves barely alive. Okinawans ate almost anything in 1946 and 1947, including dogs. As in post-war Germany, their condition generally worsened yet further from what it had been during the fighting. With virtually every settlement in ruins, they had only scraps from the rubble for building shelters. Tens of thousands lived in cartons, tar paper, and other American refuse, but no nearer than a mile to the bases and billeting areas, whose security and health were protected by prohibiting them from coming closer, never mind that it was their land. Meanwhile, they blinked at their occupiers' construction. Even during the battle, their admiration and dismay at the enemy's ability to alter nature with his explosives had been deepened by their first sight of instant roads and airfields. The American works, massive in terms of the island's history and scale, were inaugurated the day after L-Day, when young men jumped into huge construction machines as soon as areas behind the lines were judged relatively safe from Japanese artillery. Even in April, a pilot reported that much of the captured land looked more like a construction site or highway project back home than a battlefield. By June, Army engineers and Navy Seabees were well advanced in their transformation of selected areas into a Little America and an arsenal for the invasion of the mainland. A pre-war project to build a north-south highway, the length of the island had been estimated to require 10 years. Emerging from underground, natives gasped when they saw American know-how, and machines had already completed much of the job. However, the spectacular blasting and bulldozing were done with no notice of their concerns. Village remains were knocked flat to accommodate military projects, their rubble added to the new roadbeds. Entire hillsides of tombs were destroyed and paved over without a word of protest, since no native aware of the sacrilege was anywhere in sight. Too poor to return to traditional styles, when they themselves at last began building anew, the desperately ill and unhoused Okinawans turned instead to the cheapest, most accessible alternative: American military base design. A proliferation of stark concrete squares, cheap and fast to pour, spread over the South like a Marxist nightmare of proletarian hovels. Soon the valleys of some of the world's most graceful architecture were cursed with some of ugliest, a sprawl of garages, cheap shops, and instant slums. Perhaps Okinawan culture was in any case destined to be submerged in Japanese and American, in the ordinary 20th century way. But the obliteration of almost all the old, important, and beautiful greatly hastened and expanded the process.